Thank you all for being here this evening. It's great to host you for tonight's event, the third conversation in this year's series, Thinking Out Loud. My name's Carr. I'm the Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies here at the university. And one of the goals of the Thinking Out Loud series is to connect some of the research that we do here at the university with the perspectives of other experts in order to nurture engaging conversations about topics that are socially relevant, topics that resonate with the public, topics that will engage us in discussions about the society in which we live, or perhaps the society in which we hope to live. The format for Thinking Out Loud is as important as the subject, however. And as you'll hear in a moment, we're trying to go beyond the sound bites and even the Twitter sphere to rekindle the old-fashioned art of stimulating conversation. And so it's especially appropriate that tonight's conversation is about the importance of face-to-face contact and why connecting with others matters. Thank you to our Alumni Association and to our friends at the Globe and Mail for supporting this series. And now, please join me in welcoming tonight's moderator from the Globe and Mail, Wency Leung. And our conversationalists this evening, psychologist, journalist, best-selling author Susan Pinker, and Bill Bukowski, a developmental psychology from our Department of Psychology and the head of our Center for Research on Human Development. Over to these three, and I hope you really enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to you all for coming here tonight. Several years ago, I learned about the invention of a new product called the Kissinger. And Kissinger might not be a name that necessarily evokes thoughts of, fuzzy, cuddly things, but what it was a pair of devices that was designed to allow you to transmit kisses remotely over the internet. And so, say you live in Montreal and you hook up this device to your computer. It's sort of like kind of like a plastic speaker. And so say your sweetheart, who might live in Vancouver, hooks up another one to their computer. And if you simultaneously hold these devices up to your face and press your lips against them, you would be able to send and receive the sensation of each other's kisses, or at least sort of a plasticky robot version. So believe it or not, the Kissinger robots didn't really take off quite like the inventor hoped it would. So, as much as people love their gadgets, it appears by and large they don't actually want to make out with them. If you do, I'm not going to judge. But the thing is, there is something about these live in-person interactions that simply cannot be replicated. And no matter how creative the technology, and no matter how much of our lives are lived online. So tonight we're going to explore a little bit about what it is about these real connections that is so vital, and that can not only make us happier, but also healthier and more resilient, and not only for us, but for our children too. So maybe if we could start by kind of exploring what is at stake. So many of us, if not most of us, are on Facebook and Twitter, and we interact by texting and teleconferencing and so on. So Susan, what if we interact less in person?
Well, there's a difference. When I'm asked this question, I feel like I'm being asked the difference, like, what's the difference between eating an O. Henry bar in your car versus having your mother's homemade chicken soup? And I'm saying that because my mother is here, and it's the best chicken soup in the world. And I will say that it's not the same as eating a candy bar in your car, even though it might be the same number of calories, more or less. And the difference is that we're not just transmitting information, as you said in that nice introduction about Kissinger. You know, a kiss has to be in person. I actually was once in an airport lounge where I saw somebody having a very passionate discussion with their partner, and as our flight was announced, he brought his tablet up to his face and he kissed it. And I almost missed my flight because I was astonished. And I thought, do you know what you're missing, actually? But the difference is that when you're in person, there's a biological cascade of events that happens. And you don't even necessarily have to touch the person or kiss the person for it to take effect. Oxytocin is released, and when that happens, you feel good in the here and now. It makes you happier, but it also has an effect into the future. It increases your resilience. It increases your immunity. And there are other neurotransmitters as well that happen. All of this happens below the surface. And our behavior changes too. You know, when you're together with somebody, you mimic each other's body language. And there's something that we used to call chemistry, which means that you make eye contact. And something happens when you make eye contact. Something happens when you lean forward and the other person leans forward, when you lean back, when you're having a discussion and they disagree and they cross their arms, and then you do that. This kind of synchrony has been going on in our species for 10,000 years. And it helps us establish who we trust and who we don't trust. And it helps make our groups more cohesive. So I'll stop here and let Bill have a chance.
I can add to this. I think that a lot of these issues are especially important for young people in their interactions with their parents. That one of the most key features for parent-child interaction is joint attention. It means that people are paying attention to the same thing, that they're looking at the same thing, they're thinking about the same thing. That's hard to do when you're not in the same place. Joint attention is a key feature to all sorts of aspects of cognitive development, certainly emotional development. I just heard a great talk this afternoon by someone who I think is in the audience, Ross Thompson, who talked about the importance of these kinds of shared experiences for emotional development for young children. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing in my area, peer relations. The best predictor of children's friendship formation is not joint attention, but instead it's common ground. People who can share something.
We'll get back to that in just a moment, but I wonder, you mentioned, Susan, in your book about how loneliness can kill. We just talked about the benefits of face-to-face interactions, but what goes on with loneliness?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a taboo topic, loneliness. I think we're living in the age of loneliness, and people are afraid to talk about it. And I think that it's increasing because it's the path of least resistance to do things online. It's faster, it's often cheaper. People who work together now don't even get up and walk down the hall and talk to each other. They'll shoot them an email or a text. You don't necessarily have to talk to your neighbors, as we were talking about before. You can just get into your car or drive off or take the metro. You don't have to walk down the street and get your newspaper. You get it online, and even your library books can be delivered right onto your device. So things have become so streamlined that our casual interactions have reduced, and partially as a result, we've become a much lonelier society, certainly in developed economies. And some of the statistics are shocking, both on how many people and who is loneliest and what the impact is on our lifespans and our health. So there's a new study that I just read recently, in fact, as recently as yesterday. It just came out, I think, about 6 weeks ago, that shows that the more, the more in-person interaction you have, the lower your risk of depressive symptoms as an adult, and the reverse is also the case. Since I'm speaking to a university audience, this is a correlation, right? It's not, it doesn't say that one causes the other, but we do know that it's a huge study of about 11,000 adults in the United States, and they were able to track it, and very unusually, they looked at in-person versus telephone contact versus email contact, and there was a huge difference.
Right. Well, Bill, you've done some really cool research looking into what exactly what are the qualities of a relationship that actually make this difference. So what is it?
Yeah, one of the things that we've been really interested in, and this again involves some people in the audience, particularly Megan Wood, that in what it's believed, as Susan was saying, that friendships can have a unique moderating effect. They can act as ballast. They keep people centered, so to speak. We wanted to find out what's the feature of friendship that's most important. And the problem with making comments about friendship is that friendships can vary considerably one from the other in terms of its characteristics. We wanted to pair two different characteristics against each other, security versus intimacy. Wanted to find out which one is the one that seems to minimize the stability of anxiety the most. We argued that, at least for 5th and 6th grade children, so we're not talking about adults here, but still school-age children, we believe that friendship security would be the most important feature because, as I said already, it's a form of ballast. It provides certainty in an uncertain world. And so sure enough, it turned out to be the case that it was security that moderated the stability of friendship, and intimacy wasn't particularly important. I'm not trying to say that intimacy is important at other times of the lifespan, or that it might have other positive effects, but at least in terms of protecting children who are at risk for being anxious, security seemed to be far more important than intimacy. I think that this goes really up to, with some of the issues that Susan was talking about, is why is it now that there should be these times heightened levels of loneliness and feelings of alienation? It is a moment of social change. The economy has changed. The future is not quite as predictable. Growth here hasn't been what it was at one time. The future may not seem as rosy to so many people. And this kind of instability can be a source of distress. And so I think that this is one way in which friendship can act as an antidote for this, particularly certain aspects of friendship.
So in the types of relationships that you mean, then it would mean that we don't necessarily have to tell our friends a lot about ourselves. We just need to make sure that they're there.
Exactly. Yeah, one thing that we were interested in knowing about is whether or not intimacy would predict security down the line. So using good longitudinal data, does intimacy at one time predict subsequent security? And it didn't. One thing I often wonder about is whether for younger children, whether intimacy is still kind of playing with fire, that they haven't quite learned the skills that are needed. Sometimes intimacy can be a threat. Sometimes, depending upon what you're intimate about, you get two people talking about how miserable their lives are, and they'll suddenly become more miserable than they were before, even though you might say, wow, they have such an intimate relationship, they can share so much. But sharing a lot of negative talk, co-rumination it's called, can be a negative thing. So I think that, having a sense of security in your friendships is probably one of the most basic features of relationships across the lifespan. Certainly it's been the topic that has been the key feature in research on parent-child relationships, and I think it extends to friendship relations as well.
Right.
And I have a comment on that, which is that, we used to think in psychology that your feelings are over here and your intellect is over here, and they're kind of two planets that revolve on their own axes. But we do know now that social isolation, especially in teenagers, it disables their ability to think rationally. And so it's more of a Venn diagram than two different planets. And so it's not only the question of reducing anxiety, but allowing, for example, teenagers to think clearly and to make good decisions for themselves.
Right, okay.
Yeah, it's probably to a great extent the reduction in anxiety that allows the clarity of thinking.
Mm. So when we talk about qualities of relationships, Susan, you mentioned in your book something called the female effect. And first of all, maybe you can explain what that is.
Well, the female effect is a kind of pronged. In women, according to research, tend to put more emphasis on average in building and maintaining their relationships over their lifespans. They prioritize their friends, their family. They put a lot of time and effort into it. They're the ones who send the Christmas cards. They invite people for dinner. And they do this not only for themselves, but for their children and for their partners as well. So that's one way, one aspect of the female effect, as I refer to it in the book. And I took the idea from something called the widowhood effect. The widowhood effect is a long-standing finding, kind of a sad finding, that when adult men lose their wives, they're at extremely high risk of dying within 6 months to a year afterwards. And one of the reasons we're starting to think is that when their wives die, I mean, not only do they lose all of the care and the love and the intimacy, but they lose their entire social network all at one fell swoop. So that's part of what I'm talking about as the female effect, is the connections they establish for themselves, and that it actually has an impact on their health and lifespans. And just as an aside, that's where I started for this book. When I finished my last book, I was left with this question: why do women live longer? They live longer everywhere in the world where they don't still die in childbirth, and about an average of about 5 to 7 years. And part of the reason epidemiologists are finding and social scientists are finding is because of the effect of their social relationships. So that's the original idea of where the female effect came from. And the second aspect of the female effect is that relationships often have a much stronger impact on women and girls. So one example is, you know, when we have shared meals together. I started out the evening talking about food and sharing food. There is a huge impact on children and adolescents. Just sharing a meal has incredible optimistic predictive power, in that it tends to increase exponentially the child's achievement, and also reduce the child's risk of other problems such as substance abuse, eating disorders, and other things that really parents don't want for their kids. But what's really interesting is that the impact of social meals, or meals with your parents, is good for all kids, but it's especially good for girls. So that's another sort of aspect of the female effect, which is that the social relationships have, I would say, an outsized effect.
Okay. Well, Bill, as the lone male up here, how do your chances are of, well,
hey, I ate dinner with my son tonight. You saw me.
Well, what do you make of the female effect?
Yeah. Again, I typically understand these things within the context of the children that I typically study in our projects, 5th and 6th graders. Two responses. One is that there's been a lot of research on the degree to which the strengths of female relationships sometimes can be their drawback as well. There's higher levels of conflict in female relationships. Co-rumination, I've mentioned already, this constant talking about problems, can be much more frequent in female relationships. It's a famous paper by Amanda Rose and another person whose name escapes me right now, but it'll come to me. And Amanda's point was that a lot of the intimacy that girls can experience with their friends can be a positive thing, but it can raise challenges as well. She sort of sees this as the two kind of balance each other out across any sort of sample of girls. Another challenge that people have often run into when we're trying to solve this problem, understand it, is that if you look at the qualities that girls ascribe to their friendships, it looks like girls' friendships are much, much better than boys. They're more loyal. They claim to have more companionship. They claim to have higher levels of closeness. And yet, if you ask boys and girls about their satisfaction with their friendships, there's no difference. There's no difference between boys and girls. And we've been trying to sort this out, myself and a fellow that works with myself and my wife, Ryan Pesram. And what we've been trying to find out is what are the qualities of friendship that seem to be so much, that carry the satisfying baggage, so to speak, or water for boys. And again, it comes back to security. Security has a much stronger effect on the relationships for boys than it does for girls. Girls, their friendships, the stronger features of their friendships are companionship. Intimacy, not so much. I think that the point for us is that some of the things that girls might be good at, intimacy, for example, may in some cases be a source of danger. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to go so far as say that the things that girls are good at don't matter, but to some extent that might be true. And it's really amazing that the friendships of boys, they've experienced them to be equally satisfying to those of girls. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes about differences between boys and girls' peer relations, what kind of aggression is important and things of this sort. The amazing thing, though, is that for the most part, boys and girls' friendships are pretty similar to each other, except in the area of disclosure, where girls disclose at a much, much higher rate. I mean, there's no comparison. There's no comparison, but I'm not sure that the importance of it justifies the amount of time that's devoted to it. Now, if I could just state for the record here, I have 5 sisters. So I know something about this from babyhood.
Well, I have a comment about that. I think it's really interesting, and it ties into some of the research on marriage. This is a bit kind of skipping a little bit from 5th and 6th graders, but essentially, you know, for men, it's really, really great to be married, and it's really bad to lose your spouse, bad for your health. And the quality of the marriage is not that critical for men. But for women, it's the type of marriage. So if they're in a good marriage, it's good for women. And if they're in a bad marriage, say one that has high conflict or less security, well, it's terrible for the woman's health. Right. And that is not reflected as much for the men. The men, you know, it's just a question of they have their one person, that one person is there for them, has their back, that's all they need to know. But for women, the quality and sort of I guess, the layering of the relationship is extremely important for how long, not only how long they live, but things like how well do they sleep? How long do they sleep? How many times do they get up in the night? Do they have back pain, chronic back pain? Very closely tied to their marital relationship. All sorts of different outcomes, which is not at all the same.
So men out there, pull your socks up for Valentine's Day.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think my wife sleeps well, so I'm very happy about that. I guess it says something about me.
Well, speaking of Valentine's Day, let's talk a little bit about online dating. Susan, you have mentioned that there are some very big limitations to online dating. Can you explain?
Well, let's, you know, since Bill said that, you know, when you have negative talk, it can be a bad thing. So let's start off with the positives. I think anything that allows people to meet partners that might be suited to them is great, including online dating. I think what is kind of, with online dating, it should be let the buyer beware for 2 reasons. The claims of most online dating sites just do not hold water scientifically. They have never been tested, and they do not hold up against chance. So the promise that you're going to be matched
all those
with the
advertisements on TV aren't true?
Maybe you need to take one of these Concordia media courses. Yeah, no, Bill, they're not true. But that said, I mean, as I said, let's say you're living in an isolated place and you have difficulty meeting people. It might be a way to meet people if you are very judicious and if you're very cautious. I think many people spend much more time, you know, investigating things like a used car or, you know, buying any other consumer item of smartphone than they would investigating who is exactly this person that they're going to be meeting online. Because let's face it, you can hide a lot about you, and the research about online dating is actually very amusing. men tend to lie about their height and how much they earn and what they do for a living, and women tend to lie about their weight. And as one person who I describe in my book, who was, I guess I would say, a serial online dater, said, you have to watch out for the sunglasses. Women tend to lie about their age and their weight. Men, it's more their height and their income. And so you don't really, and that's just a cipher or a representative for other things that they may be lying about as well.
Sounds good. There was one specific thing that you mentioned in your book about online dating, and you say that sexual attraction is a lot like art or porn or wine. You can't really put it into words what you like about it, but you know it when you see it. So maybe, Bill, maybe you could would you care to share your story about how you met your own wife?
Oh.
So glad that's you, Bill.
Yeah. Well, this might sound like a ridiculous place to start, but I think that it has meaning, and it goes back to something I referred to already. And that's that my wife and I met each other in 1914 when our grandfathers started going to law school together. And it might sound like a foolish thing to say, but I think it's true, because it meant that even before Nina and I met, there was already like this shared developmental history. There was already like a lot of overlap between our lives, even though we never met each other until we were 30 years old or so. And I knew, if you could get out a piece of paper and write all this down, it's going to take a while. I knew Nina because her mother was my university art history professor. I knew Nina because I'll try not to burst into tears, but I feel like it, because her uncle took care of a cousin of mine who died of leukemia, and he became a member of the family. I also knew Nina because her uncle, the same one I referred to a second ago, was a physician. He was a hematologist, and his office was right beside my father's office. Also, at the end of our grandfather's careers, they had the corner offices in a building full of lawyers in downtown Buffalo, where I grew up, and Nina spent her teenage years. And Nina's grandfather's office was directly above my grandfather's office. You could drill a hole in the floor and see my grandfather's head. So before we met each other, there were already all of this overlap between us. And in some ways, when we first started talking to each other, we had met, and then there were some years in between this, met again, and so on. And it has to do with sort of a theme for tonight, in the sense that we would talk to each other on the phone at night. This was in the mid-1980s, 1987 actually. And we would talk to each other on the phone, and things would be said that might be ambiguous. And so the next day we would crank up the computer, could take a while, and we'd send a message and say, last night you said such and such, and I wonder if you could clarify the meaning of those words for me. And so that's sort of how our relationship went. That's how we got to know each other. And then we got married.
Right. How about you, Susan? How did you meet your husband?
Oh, okay. So I'm in for the same treatment. Well, I was a McGill student in my last year of my undergraduate program, and I was applying for graduate funding from what was then called the Canada Council for graduate work, and I met this handsome young man with a lot of hair and a big beard, and as he was coming out, I was sitting on those orange molded plastic chairs of that era that are now collector's items, waiting to speak to the graduate counselor. And as he came out, we had our eyes met, and we had a brief conversation, and it's amazing, he kindly offered to help me with my graduate application. And because he was coming back to renew his Canada Council funding, he was in the middle of a doctoral degree in France. And wasn't that kind of him to do that, to make that offer? And we did get together and have dinner. We didn't actually discuss grantsmanship or anything, but he did remind me recently that he said, well, did you get the grant or didn't you? And I said, I did. He said, see? So yes, so we met face to face, and we had that kind of chemistry that I was referring to, in that you know it when you see it kind of experience. And I think, getting back to your question about online dating, I think, you know, they advertise these algorithms, and I think you have to bring the most powerful algorithm into the equation, which is your brain. Your brain has a much better problem-solving capacity. It is much better than figuring out who is right for you than is chemistry.com.
Right. Well, those are such lovely stories,
Yes.
and neither of you used the Kissinger, which is great. So, but you know, Bill's story made me think of something. Susan, in your book, you mention how it's not just the close relationships that we have with it's not just the close relationships that we have that matter. It's the weaker connections, the people, the acquaintances we have also make a difference. Can you explain how our weaker connections may also be just as important?
Yeah, it seems sort of counterintuitive, but you know, you could see your relationships as the people who are really close to you and who really matter to you a lot. And you know, by the way, the number of those relationships has gone down quite a bit in 40 years. We used to have an average of about 3, and now we have a little less, or to be grammatical, a little fewer than 2, and that's significant. Then there are the medium-range relationships. These could be your colleagues, your neighbors, the people that you meet a few times a week as you cross paths, and so that, you know, if you, for example, are a young parent, these are the people you might meet in the park. If you're a student, these are the people you sit down next to in your class. They're not your best friends, but you know their names and you talk to them. And then there are the more distant relationships still, and those ones can be on the internet, but what I'm referring to are kind of just one step beyond that. So you know their name, maybe not too much about them. And what's really interesting is that what studies are telling us is that for our happiness and for our health and to live a long life, you need not just the close people who are there for you, who will lend you $100 if you need it, or who will take you to your doctor's appointment if you need it, but you also need what's called social integration. And what they mean by that is these are the people that you might bowl with, as Robert Putnam would say, or that you might play hockey with, that you might play bridge with. They might be people that you meet in your church or your mosque or your synagogue. You know them a little, but you don't know them a lot. And when you get out and participate in the community, you form those relationships. And it's the measure of those relationships, how often you get out, how many of those, how many times a week, how many people you get to know, that partially predicts how long you'll live. And this is research that's both very recent and, I would say, getting there in the hoary department. It was Lisa Berkman at Harvard who started this by looking at the relationships of everybody in a town in California, Alameda County. And she just charted everything about their social lives, and then she sat tight and watched what happened to them. So she started studying this, and that kind of launched this idea that our social relationships are so important.
Right, okay. So I wonder what kind of practical steps could we take to sort of build in more in-person time into our days? Maybe Bill, you want to take that?
Yeah, again, I think about this in terms of the children that we study. I think that I'm struck at how many classrooms with it effective teachers provide time every day for children to interact quietly with each other in the room. I don't think that you might necessarily get this kind of action on the playground, where there's a lot of rough and tumble play, where maybe not everybody's included, but that these sorts of opportunities to interact with everybody and to develop at least some kind of contact with every child in the classroom seems to be something really important. And as Susan was saying before, I think that it can be a key feature in terms of just sort of the success of the way the classroom functions as a group across the school year. This is inexpensive. It doesn't cost a penny. I think that one thing that's difficult right now, for example, in a university context, if we go to the older people, older individuals, is that it's so easy to stay home. It's cold outside. You can get into the library through your computer. You can get access to all your documents through Dropbox and so on. There's no need to go to the office. I think that by building better spaces, and say in university spaces, workspaces, it's going to want people to be there and take advantage of the informal communications that often form that are the bedrock of decision making. You know, sure, there's important formal mechanisms, but to provide people with a space where communication is easy, not only forges togetherness, so to speak, on a personal level, but also on an institutional level. And I think it's easy to do, but people have to think about it.
Right. And how about you, Susan? What do you...
Well, I think that Bill is absolutely right in that we have to intentionally decide that we're going to talk to each other. And in the workplace, in the university classroom as well. And the data are there, for example, that you mentioned anecdotally, that when teachers provide this environment for students to interact informally, and it's also the interaction between the teacher and the student that we're finding from, believe it or not, economists is incredibly valuable to student and to child development and to teenagers being successful. But in terms of just regularly going through your day and organizing your life, it has come to the point where you have to, I think, decide and think about it. You know, how much contact are you actually getting, and are you getting enough? Just like the way you think of leafy greens, right? The way you think of exercise. Actually, if you want to be healthy and live a long life, it's more important that you get out and see people in person than it is that then you give up smoking or give up, you know, drinking or reduce your drinking. It's that important. For example, talking about teenagers, there was a study recently that showed that teenagers who had less social contact, in-person social contact, had higher rates of inflammation that were correlated exactly with the rates of inflammation that they saw in kids who were sedentary, who had no exercise. So just the way we say, oh, you know, I have to go to the gym today, or I have to actually buy some fresh fruits and vegetables, we have to think about building social contact into our day because, as Bill said, it's the path of least resistance to just do everything through your screen. And so, and it's easy and we all do it. And in some respects we have to. But what I mean by that is coming out to events like this is tremendously important, especially in the winter. I think our climate is very difficult for social interaction in Canada, and I think people who design our cities have to start thinking about this a little bit better, and not just in terms of shops that are underground, but places people can meet, what are called third spaces that are not directly linked to commercial activity. So people can get out and talk to each other and meet each other. And I might just bring in another thread that probably is going to sound like a red herring to you, but I think that as religion has declined in our lives, especially in Quebec, we've lost a lot of communal centers where we used to get together. You know, our churches where people used to go for either solitude or to volunteer or to be with other people, they're condos now, right? And we've lost those public spaces. So we have to think about what are we going to do. I mean, I personally, as I did the research on this book, there was so much that was new. You know, when you're a writer, you have to write a book proposal, so you have to do a lot of work in advance, and I kind of thought I knew the area. And as I was writing the book, I learned so many new things, and research continues to evolve, that I actually had to change my own habits, right? So, you know, a writer is, by definition, in a solitary profession. A researcher, too, I think, has a lot of solitary time. But I started to have to think about well, you know, it's 2 p.m. and I actually haven't had my social time today. Or, you know, oh, I'm doing my exercise alone. Maybe I should do it with other people. And by the way, if you do exercise with other people, you work harder, you know, and it doesn't seem to be as painful. So there are ways that you can build social contact, and even something as simple as finding a new apartment. You know, what do we usually look for? Closet space, maybe a driveway if you have a car. How close are you to the subway station? But what you really have to look for is, where do people in that neighborhood meet? Where do they get together? Do the neighbors talk to each other? Because if they don't, you don't want to live there.
Right. Wow. So everybody take advantage of tonight and like make sure you talk to each other afterward.
Or even go out to a bar or coffee shop afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. So contact is one thing. The other, to actually get over loneliness, though, is the next step. And Bill, how can you? You've talked about educators doing this, but how do you actually get kids to make friends with each other?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that, because I was hoping you were going to ask something along these lines. I was involved in a study a few years ago that involved what has become, for better or worse, the flavor of the week, victimization. There's been a lot of really expensive intervention programs to deal with victimization. Colleagues of mine in the Netherlands, they decided, you know, one problem with victimization is anonymity. The victim is not seen as a real person by the bully. So how do you get rid of that? Take the bully, take the victim, and sit them beside each other in class. This might sound like a script written for disaster, but what happened was the bully got to know the victim, and all of a sudden the victimization went away. So inexpensive, you know, it doesn't cost anything to change seating arrangements in the classroom. And yet this very simple kind of manipulation got people to know each other. In the same project, we're trying to look now at whether or not these changed seating relations helped people who were originally isolated to have a stronger set of social contacts. Something very inexpensive. But I think that shared projects, anything that's going to give people the kind of common ground that I was talking about before, is going to help them form relationships. When you think about the things that young parents do with their young children, play dates, get people together. That's where relationships come from, interactions. Once you've had a long set of interactions that have been successful, people internalize those into a relationship, whether it's an attachment relationship with parents, where you have this internal working model, yes, I can trust my parent to take care of me, or whether it's your friend. I can trust my friend to be there. I can make predictions about their behavior. It all comes from interaction. The more opportunities for interaction there are, the more opportunities, the more likely that there's going to be the establishment of common ground and the formation of a friendship. I mean, this is what Susan was talking about before in terms of, hey, having a group of people with whom you, in a context in which you can interact with them, that's the road by which friendships are going to form. Some may not be particularly intense friendships, but there'll be some level of interaction that will eventually at least provide the basis for some kind of internalized understanding of the other person.
Right.
And it's easier said than done. You know, some people have problems maintaining those kinds of interactions because their social skills, their prediction skills aren't so good, their perspective-taking skills aren't so good. They might be anxious and so on. But I think that with effort, and it's a battle, long-term battle for some people, but eventually people get there.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add something to that, is that there, as you just mentioned, there are individual differences about how much social contact each of us wants and needs. We're not all created the same, but if you consider social contact like our other biological drives, like hunger, thirst, sleep, sex, we're not all created the same. But you know, even if, say, for example, somebody has a small appetite, you wouldn't expect them to give up eating altogether. Yet, right now in our society, it seems to be okay for people to say, well, you know, I'm introverted, so you know, I'm much more comfortable interacting online because it's difficult for me or it's hard for me to get out. And what we're learning is that we all need social contact. I think that people who are introverted, who, by the way, I think it's overblown how many people are truly introverted in the human population. It's about 20 to 20%. But even people who are introverted, if they don't socialize in person, their immunity is compromised. They catch more colds, they get sick more often, and they're unhappier. So it's a fallacy, really, that if you find it difficult, it's better to just avoid it.
Right, okay. Susan, I know that you went to Sardinia to talk to some of the longest-lived people on Earth, and I wondered what kind of lessons did you take away from how their social networks work, and what could we learn from them?
Well, Wency, I went there originally because it was the only place in the world where men lived as long as women. So I thought, I have to go there and see this myself. And when I got there, one of the things I realized is that one of the answers is the incredible social cohesion for both men and women in the society. But the flip side of social cohesion is they don't accept strangers very easily. So I write about that in the book where, I appeared in the town with my daughter and everybody was watching our every move. And to the degree, and this is just an anecdote, we had an interpreter to speak to these elderly members of society, and we gave her the afternoon off and we went wandering around the town and we went into the bar and the grocery store, and the hostility to a stranger in the town was so acute that one woman said to me in Italian, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" I mean, you wouldn't normally hear that in a more urban center. But when she heard, what we were doing, and my interpreter, Delia, and we were going to go there for dinner, and I said, "What do you think I should bring for my hosts?" Thank goodness for Italian 101. And she warmed up completely because she could place me in the social order. And I will say that what was most remarkable was that the older people, some of whom were as old as 102, 105, were very much at the center of their community. They were very highly respected, they were looked after at home, and they were a part of everything that was going on, and they were considered to be the treasure of their community. That said, it was it's an agrarian, rural lifestyle, and I don't think we're going to see this effect lasting into the next generation, because I think that the younger generation, so it would be, say, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of that generation, they are going to be moving farther away and seeking employment. And I asked the younger sister of my interpreter, who was about 16, her parents said to me, everybody does it. We all take care of our parents, men, women, we take off work to do it. It's normal, it's expected. So I turned to this young lady and who was drying her hair in front of the fire. She'd just gone to soccer practice. So I said, what about you? Are you going to take care of your parents when, they get to be that age? And she said, are you kidding? She said, let the Russians do it. I'm not going to be sticking around for that. And so I think I saw something very unusual that was a snapshot in time. And I'm not sure it will persist, but I think we can still learn the lessons from that, which is that the social contact in large part, not completely, but in large part, allowed these people, and especially the men, to live such long lives. And not only that, it created the desire for them to live a long life, because essentially, if you're lonely, really, you may not want to live that long. And here were people who, of course, their spouses, they'd lost their spouses, some of them, even some of their children had died. After all, their children were in their 70s, right? But they had a whole community still around them, and that was what was most impressive to me.
Right, okay. I think we're at the point of the night where we can take some questions. Oh. If I can just remind any of you who have questions to please keep it short and get right to it, and we can get right to the answer.
Can I ask you to talk about older people and how you see that when somebody is widowed or is a widower, assisted living or environments where they move into an area where there are other people of their age in similar situation. Do you see this as an advantage, as a disadvantage? How to optimize their lives for the time that they have left?
It's a very complicated question with a sort of a shaded answer, because not all of these places are equal. Some of them are, there are other people around, but there are no real opportunities, genuine opportunities to form relationships. And so I think that in the ideal situation, they would be created just like a neighborhood is created, where people have autonomy. They can socialize with people they like and stay away from people they don't. And they can have activities that are easy for them to get to, but that they can make choices, and that nothing is forced on them. So I think that, I think it's a very complicated social question. Sardinia didn't have any places like that. The children and the nieces and nephews filled that role. And, it wasn't always women. Sometimes it was men. But here, that's often just not possible. We need some assistance. And so that's where these assisted living arrangements come in. But as I said before, you have to really see that it's a place where people are respected and where they have the opportunity to exercise their autonomy to the degree that they would in their own home. Like, just because somebody, say, can no longer be mobile on their own or prepare their own food on their own or do all those things, you can help them with that while making sure that every aspect of what makes life worth living is still there. I mean, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Question over here.
I'd like to get your perspective on how the economic impacts or economic impositions have contributed to a breakdown in social interactions or degradation of social interactions in our society.
Bill, you kind of touched on this before.
Yeah, I think that in a few ways. One, I think that as the future may be becoming less predictable, the idea that everyone's going to have a job when they emerge from high school or from university isn't as strong as it used to be. I think that that means that some levels of interpersonal competition become higher, and that sometimes can break down the positive relations between people, particularly in school settings. I also think that as the demands for work become higher, Susan talked before about opportunities for families to have meals together. As people's hours, sounds like a good thing, flexible hours, but it always isn't a good thing. It means that opportunities for this become less predictable as well. Also, to go back actually to the question that was answered before, as people have to become more mobile for work, opportunities to maintain friendships that one's had over their entire lifespan that can be so important for older people, that becomes more challenging as well.
If I may, just as a clarification, a lot of the corporations are making decisions based solely on economics. If I look at the universities, for example, offering online courses, the economics for the online courses certainly is there, but doesn't that contribute to a breakdown in the social interaction and creativity in the forming of relationships?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that in that I think that paradoxically, our increasing digital involvement is increasing the class divide. And you don't see Bill Gates having important meetings over Skype. Okay, you don't see the movers and shakers in industry or even in research labs or in important businesses saying, having meetings online. They get on a flight and they see people face to face, because that's how you solve complex problems. And as you mentioned, even something like education, where so much of education is like what we're doing this evening. We're having an interaction. You are here, you see people, you can ask a question, you can hear the response. When that moves online, and of course it is cheaper for everybody, for the institutions, often for the student, something essential is lost. And the people who are paying that price are often the people who don't have deep pockets. And I'm particularly concerned about that. I write about that in my book, because often people who, I guess, are the most vulnerable in society, so for example, the very young, who are now in classrooms where they don't get a teacher's attention, they get an online course, even in primary school, and everybody just thinks this is dandy, to a university student who may want to pursue an advanced degree but can't afford it, so does it online. And it's not just the education, but also the contacts that they miss out on. They don't get to meet people. And it's older people in society who see their friends, their children, important people either get sick or die or move away, and they're left with Skype, right? So, you know, I'm quite concerned that this is going to be essentially the McDonald's of social interaction.
Yeah, if I could just add one comment. I agree with what Susan's saying, but with one small caveat, and that's that I think that sometimes it has to come down to what's the alternative. So for example, in our department, we've decided that a course that's taken by several students every semester, that we might offer an online version of that, because we know that for some people they just can't come to the campus because they have other family commitments, because they have work commitments and so forth. So to some extent it's a convenience issue, but no one believes that it's the real thing.
Thank you.
This question over here.
Hi, good evening. Actually, my question is a continuation of the last one. Our conversation began with that the technology replaced a lot of the human interaction. And in your last answer to the gentleman's question was that the online world wasn't really real. So what I want to say is the technology is already become part of our life and have increased the accessibility of so many things, and the connectivity of the human relationship between really extended beyond the physical separation. How do we, I think the conversation could be steered in a way that to improve the technology, to improve the human relationship, instead of working against it, that it's not replacing the interaction, but how do we use the technology to enhance this interaction that is actually does not happen in person? Any thoughts?
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have some ideas. I would say that simple things like the way Skype is designed right now, there is no eye contact. An engineer could solve that problem so that the camera is not focused at somebody's forehead. It doesn't seem like it's impossible to solve this, right? So that's kind of some idea. I think the technology will continue to evolve, but I think that our understanding of what is appropriate for digital communication and what is appropriate for in-person communication will evolve in tandem. So just as Wency started our discussion with the, what was it, Kissimeter? Kissinger.
Kissinger.
You know, essentially anything that can be quantified is, almost anything, is pretty well suited for online communication. So logistics, search functions, etc. Things that are still, I guess, beginning to be quantified, but we're still not there. It's much harder to communicate that digitally. And I think, as I said, as you're right, it will evolve. I don't think it's an an either or, and I think that's a very naive way of looking at it. I agree with you. It has to be a combination and a judicious way of deciding what can be decided or solved or communicated digitally and what really needs to be done in person.
Yeah, I think you answered your question yourself. You said, you know, how can we start to use it better? And that's what I think people should think about. I mean, at the end of a lot of emails that I receive, there's a little message that says, do you need to print this? And you know, sometimes I think the email should say, do you need to send an email instead of picking up the telephone and calling the person? You know, it's not that hard to do.
Thank you.
Question over here.
Yes, thank you very much. Curious about either observations or perhaps even something more research-based with respect to what I would call institutional relationships with children, relationships that are built in that contact which happens in places like schools and or by extension daycares versus what I might call more spontaneous neighborhood, child-organized, things that aren't necessarily brokered through an adult or a supervisor, and whether there is, in your minds, or any evidence that there's a real distinction between that in terms of its effect.
Well, you know, I think that teachers are increasingly cognizant of the fact that that in spite of the heavy emphasis on testing, that in spite of the heavy emphasis on trying to produce outcomes, that their most powerful role in the classroom is to sort of scaffold or support individual children's efforts to not only do well in school but to interact with others. That one of their primary goals is to create an atmosphere, a social atmosphere in the classroom that's conducive to learning. And so I think that, you know, in institutional settings, the ideas about cohesion and structure and so forth are at the top of people's minds, or at least the teachers that I interact with. I think that in some schools where children might struggle a bit more and where there's a lot of pressure to show results by the end of the school year, that sometimes this, unfortunately, in the cases that it might be needed the most, where concerns about cohesion and people getting along with each other and forming strong relations might be put to the side in an effort to produce results, you know, positive grades and things of this sort. I think that people in institutions are aware of this.
Yeah, point taken. And certainly within the Quebec education program, socialization is projected on par with qualification. Simply,
yeah.
You know, learning and socializing are both given equal weight. But I guess the question is, in a system where the after school face-to-face, that informal kind of natural thing that used to happen with kids is now brokered through daycare or after-school programs. Is the value lessened? Is the value decreased by that, or is it equal?
Well, once again, I have to give a shaded answer because not all of those activities are identical. Some of the activities are designed so that the students do interact. Yeah. And some of them are the opposite. I mean, I remember there was a homework program for one of my kids who was just here a moment ago in high school where essentially they had to sit at desks and be silent and do their homework for an hour and a half, and this was their after-school activity. And frankly, as a parent, I was paying for this and I was appalled. And so it depends. Some activities are putting kids in a gym with basketballs and having them play. I think the alternative concern is that parents are so concerned about safety now that they don't want to let their kids play outside, especially if they're at work. So what they do is they imprison kids at home where the kids have nothing else to do but use the screen, and often in an unsupervised way, instead of what kids are built to do, which is to interact and to play. So that's sort of the flip side of your question as well.
So we're getting close to the end of the evening, so we'll...
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll take the next question, please.
Hi there. Ooh, that's loud. So my question is about, well, it seems that face-to-face communication affects not only our immune system, but our psychosocial development, and a lot of the examples that were given were like in the classroom and young kids and what we can do. But if it's a prolonged absence or connection with face-to-face over decades, and is it ever too late to counteract those negative effects? And as a professor here, when I think of all those students coming to my class, and is there something I can do in terms of like helping that along?
Yeah, I think that I'm inclined sometimes to think more strongly about things that are highly deterministic in terms of early experiences. But I wouldn't, there's not a lot of evidence about this, but I'm presuming that some of the problems that people can pick up in youth can be remediated later on. What can teachers do? I'll sometimes ask my own children who are here tonight about what is it that makes a university professor great. And I expected them to say, oh, stimulating and fascinating lectures. But that's not what they said. They said, we like people who are fair. And I interpret that to mean that someone who creates a secure atmosphere in the department, in the classroom, where people can make predictions about what's going to happen. I think that kind of ballast, that kind of security, goes a long way to helping people function and to deal with potential anxieties.
Thank you.
Next question.
Good evening. So my question actually wants to play with the topic, face-to-face. I catch myself listening to the radio a lot. So at one point tonight, I closed my eyes and thought, so what's the difference here? And I was thinking, I want to pose the question back to you, having a conversation together, what stood out for you interacting together, having a dialogue, and and what are you taking away from this evening? What have you learned about each other by having a face-to-face discussion?
All right.
I learned how Susan met her husband. That's one thing. It's one thing I learned that I hadn't known before.
And I would say similarly that I couldn't do the job that I do without people like Bill who are doing research and who are producing the data. I mean, in my book and in my work, I tell stories, it's true, but I feel there's no stories to tell without data. But here I meet a living, breathing human being. He has a sense of humor. He has a sense of humor. He has a story. I learned about how he met his wife. And we actually created the beginnings of a relationship that didn't exist before. Thank you, Concordia and the Globe and Mail. And I'm actually going to lean on him now to send me his findings. And, it'll mean something different to me. I will say that, I'm also a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I don't think people who read my column realize that I actually live in Canada. But when I have the rare opportunity of profiling research that's done here in Montreal, I get out of my office and I go to meet the person, even though it takes 4 times as long as it would as if I just picked up the phone. And I do it because the relationship with researchers enriches my job, and it creates something that is built for the future. It's what gumshoes used to do, right? Wency, you used to have your little black book of contacts, and you actually knew these people, right? Yeah. So I think it's very different than just communicating in other types of ways, and I'm very grateful that institutions like this one create that kind of opportunity.
Just going to give a quick answer from another angle. I agree with what Susan's saying, but from another point of view, what's so great about face-to-face? You get to find out immediately your effect on somebody else. You see how their face responds. You know if the message that you're trying to get across has come across in the way that you might expect it, or whether you should reframe it, whether you should back off on something, and so forth. The other thing is that you can pick up things that you can't necessarily pick up at all through email. Believe me, I've had bad experiences. What's the real tone of the person's voice? What are they? Is it sarcasm? Is it not sarcasm? What's the deal here? The other thing is that the give and take can be quicker. In that respect, you can get to common ground more quickly. You get there faster. And those are all good things. Those are things that are going to make things move along. I think another thing is that there's more opportunities for repair. Now, one quick study that I haven't mentioned tonight is that once we asked children almost exactly at this time of the year to give us a part of their body, particularly give us saliva, 20 different times. And from that saliva, we were able to find out about the activity of a very important stress response system in the body, the HPA axis that produces cortisol. And we knew each time that they gave us that saliva, and we could measure their cortisol, whether they were having a negative experience and whether they were with a friend or not. And when they were having a negative experience and they were without a friend, their HPA axis spiked up, higher levels of cortisol. When they were with a friend, no difference. So the presence of the friend really minimized the need for a stress response. In the long term, that means that the HPA axis, fundamental part of the body's physiology, is not going to get worn down. It preserves that for the rest of their life. And so I think that this is a powerful way in which day-to-day contact with people helps preserve people's functioning across the lifespan. Sorry about the long answer.
So we'll just take 2 more questions.
And I have a very short question, and I really appreciate the qualitative nature of face-to-face contact, which leads me, never mind about digital education, but the whole qualitative issue of class size. It seems to me that our educational systems, from elementary all the way straight up to the university levels, has expanded the classroom so that the contact time, never mind just face-to-face, in fact, not sure if somebody is performing or to what extent their learning can take place. I'm sure it does, to what extent it's a lecture, but it seems to me that the qualitative nature of the face-to-face is compromised. I don't know if you can share your opinions on that in terms of class size, the sizes of the classroom, like 500 students, 400 students, 200
Don't forget
students.
you're at Concordia. The largest class I've ever taught here is about 60 people.
Well, you're fortunate.
I think that's about the largest class that's taught in our department.
Well, I don't think that all classes are like that across the university, but even in elementary school, the idea that we have 40 students in grade 5 seems an awful lot.
I'd be surprised. I'm not sure how many 40-student classrooms there'd be in the province of Quebec. My guess is that they probably top out more closer to about 25.
Okay, well, in that case, thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight, and thank you, Bill and Susan.
Yeah. There you go.